I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and come with me." The air marshal's voice was final. He saw a threat, not a 17-year-old girl with a valid first-class ticket. As he loomed over Zara, threatening arrest, he was oblivious to the open phone line in her hand. He couldn't hear the voice of her father, on the other end, Malcolm Jackson, the billionaire CEO whose cybersecurity firm held the multi-billion-dollar contract protecting the entire airline. The Marshal thought he was removing a problem. He had no idea he was about to become the reason for his own termination. This isn't just a story about a flight. It's about the moment power prejudice and a father's love collided at 30,000 FT, leaving a trail of ruined careers in its wake. Have you ever been judged solely by your appearance? Ever walked into a room and felt the weight of assumptions pressing down on you before you even spoke? If you've experienced the sting of prejudice or witnessed the quiet violence of discrimination, drop your experiences in the comments below. And if you believe justice should be blind but isn't always, hit that subscribe button and share this video. In exactly 45 minutes, not just a seat, but an entire 300-passenger aircraft will be grounded. 3 careers will end, and 1 corporation will face a billion-dollar reckoning. But first, let's meet the young woman at the center of this storm. The scent of premium leather and subtle clean air freshener was the first thing Zara Jackson noticed. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic energy of JFK's Terminal 4, a human river of frantic energy she had just navigated. Here in Seat 2A of Trans-Global Airways Flight 88, a non-stop to San Francisco, the world was serene. The seat was less a seat and more a personal pod, a cocoon of beige upholstery and polished chrome that whispered of exclusivity. At 17, Zara was no stranger to air travel, but this was different. This was her first time flying solo in first class. It was a graduation gift from her father, Malcolm, but it was also a practical necessity. Tucked into the oversized carry-on at her feet was a prototype for a neural interface. She had designed a delicate piece of equipment worth more than the car she'd be learning to drive next year. The flight wasn't just a journey. It was the first leg of her future. In San Francisco, she was set to begin a 3-month fellowship at the prestigious Lions Applied Sciences Incubator, a place where teenage prodigies were given millions in funding to turn their wildest ideas into reality. Zara's neural interface promised to revolutionize how people with severe disabilities could communicate, potentially giving voice to those who had been silenced by their conditions. Zara was a creator, a builder. Her world was one of code circuits and the elegant logic of machine learning. She saw the world in systems and patterns, and the pattern she was currently observing was one of quiet efficiency. A flight attendant with a warm smile and a name tag that read, Diana had already offered her a pre-departure drink. She'd chosen sparkling water with lime, and the low hum of the Boeing 777's auxiliary power was a soothing mantra. She pulled out her tablet, not to watch a movie, but to review the final lines of her presentation code. Her fingers danced across the screen, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was in her element, a focused island of intellectual rigor in a sea of opulent calm. Malcolm Jackson's words echoed in her mind from their conversation. The previous evening. You've earned your place at every table you sit at, Zara. Never let anyone make you feel you have to apologize for being there. Her father had built his cybersecurity empire Nexus Cyber Shield from nothing, facing doubters and barriers at every turn. He'd taught her that dignity wasn't requested. It was claimed. It was. The delicate equilibrium was disturbed by a sharp, perfumed sigh. Zara looked up from her tablet to see a woman in her mid-50s maneuvering a rigid, oversized designer handbag into the overhead bin above Seat 2B directly across the aisle. The woman was impeccably dressed in a tailored, cream-colored pantsuit. Her blonde hair coiffed into a helmet of immovable perfection. Her face, however, was soured into a mask of faint disapproval as her eyes swept over Zara. It was a look Zara had seen before. A look that assessed her dark skin, her neatly braided hair, her simple but stylish hoodie and jeans, and concluded that they did not belong in this environment. The woman's gaze lingered for a fraction of a second too long, a silent audit that found Zara wanting. "Excuse me?" The woman said, her voice crisp and carrying an unearned authority. She wasn't speaking to Zara, but to the air around her, as if summoning a subordinate. Miguel, a younger flight attendant with an anxious-to-please demeanor, hurried over. "Yes, ma'am. Can I help you with that?" he offered, gesturing to the still open bin. "I can handle my own bag." "Thank you," she snapped before lowering her voice to a conspiratorial, yet clearly audible whisper. "I just want to be sure everything is in order in this cabin. There seems to be some confusion about the seating." She flicked her eyes pointedly toward Zara. Zara felt a familiar hot knot tighten in her stomach. She refused to look over. She kept her eyes fixed on her tablet, the lines of Python code suddenly seeming like a foreign language. She could feel the woman's stare of physical weight on her shoulder. She told herself to ignore it. This woman, Vanessa Whitmore, as she would soon learn her name, was just a random data point of unpleasantness in a world full of it. An anomaly in the system. Miguel, the flight attendant, glanced from Ms. Whitmore to Zara, his inexperience showing. He was a deer in the headlights caught between a demanding passenger and a potential conflict he clearly didn't know how to handle. "All passengers have been boarded according to their tickets, ma'am," he stammered. Behind his professional smile, Miguel's thoughts raced. 6 months on the job, and I'm already facing this. My sister's tuition payment is due next week. Mom's medication costs doubled last month. I can't afford a complaint on my record. The pressure crushed down on his shoulders like a physical weight. "Really," Ms. Whitmore said, her voice dripping with skepticism. She finally settled into her seat, pulling her seatbelt tight with a series of sharp, angry tugs. "Because it's my understanding that first class is for paying customers, not guests or people who've wandered into the wrong section." The insinuation was as thick and suffocating as the cabin air before the filtration system fully kicked in. Zara's fingers tightened on her tablet. She knew she had 2 options. She could shrink, make herself small and invisible, and pray the woman would lose interest, or she could hold her ground. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, a memory from a conversation they'd had just last week. "You've earned your place at every table you sit at, Zara. Never let anyone make you feel you have to apologize for being there." For a fleeting moment, she considered giving in, taking the path of least resistance, moving to another seat if available, or even requesting a downgrade to economy. The thought of spending 6 hours next to this woman's quiet hostility was exhausting. The burn of injustice flared hot in her chest, quickly replaced by a cooler, more determined resolve. No, this was exactly what people like Vanessa Whitmore counted on, that their targets would choose invisibility over confrontation. She took a slow, deliberate breath, closed her tablet, and placed it in the seat back pocket. Then she turned her head and met Vanessa Whitmore's icy gaze with a calm, steady one of her own. "Is there a problem?" Zara asked, her voice even and clear, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. The directness of the question seemed to momentarily startle Ms. Whitmore. She blinked, her pursed lips tightening further. "I was just expressing a concern about airline security and seating integrity." She deflected, wrapping her prejudice in the sterile language of corporate policy. One can't be too careful these days. Before Zara could respond, Diana, the senior flight attendant, arrived. Her presence was a balm of professionalism. She had overheard the exchange from the galley. "Ms. Whitmore, is everything all right with your seat?" Diana asked, her tone polite but firm, subtly reclaiming control of the situation from Miguel. "My seat is fine," Vanessa replied, gesturing with a flick of her wrist towards Zara. "I'm just not convinced hers is." Diana turned to Zara, a hint of apology in her eyes. "Miss May, I see your boarding pass for a moment just to clear this up for the other passenger." The knot in Zara's stomach tightened into a painful fist. It was humiliating. She was being audited publicly because this woman had decided she didn't look the part, but she also understood Diana was trying to de-escalate. Arguing would only make it worse. With methodical precision, she reached into her bag, pulled out the crisp paper of her boarding pass, and handed it to Diana. Diana glanced at it, her expression unchanging. "Thank you, Miss Jackson," she said pointedly, using Zara's name as she handed it back. She then turned to Ms. Whitmore. "As you can see, the passenger in 2A is ticketed for this seat. Everything is in order. We will be closing the cabin door for departure in just a few moments." Diana's words were final. She gave Ms. Whitmore a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and retreated towards the front of the cabin. For a moment, there was silence. Zara felt a small wave of relief. It was over. She was wrong. For people like Vanessa Whitmore, it was never over. She had been publicly contradicted, and her sense of superiority was wounded. Vanessa pulled out her phone, her thumbs tapping furiously across the screen. Zara tried once more to retreat into her own world, pulling out noise-cancelling headphones. But as she did, she heard Ms. Whitmore's voice, now low and venomous, speaking into her phone. "Yes, I'm on the flight. No, it's a mess. There's a person up here who is being very aggressive and confrontational. The flight attendants aren't doing anything. Frankly, I don't feel safe." Zara's blood ran cold. The script had been flipped. The accusation had escalated from "you don't belong here" to "you are a threat." Vanessa Whitmore wasn't just prejudiced. She was weaponizing it, turning a quiet teenager into an aggressive threat in the post-911 lexicon of air travel. The system wasn't just experiencing an anomaly. It was being deliberately corrupted, and Zara was the target. The lie hung in the air, a poisonous vapor. Zara could feel the atmosphere in the cabin shift. A few nearby passengers who had overheard Ms. Whitmore's phone call now cast nervous, furtive glances in her direction. She was no longer just a young woman in first class. She was now the subject of a security concern, a potential problem. The presumption of her innocence had been stolen in a single malicious sentence. Across the aisle in seat 1C, an elderly white gentleman in an expensive suit frowned, shaking his head slightly. He'd been watching the entire interaction. Now he leaned toward his companion and whispered, "Disgraceful behavior. That poor girl hasn't done a thing." Behind Zara in row 3, a middle-aged Latina woman caught her eye in the reflection of the window and gave her a small, encouraging nod, a silent gesture of solidarity. Zara removed her headphones, the silence of the cabin now more deafening than any music. She looked to Diana, who was busy with pre-flight checks near the cockpit door, seemingly unaware of this new escalation. Miguel, however, had heard it. He stood frozen near the galley, his eyes wide, looking at Zara as if seeing her for the first time through Vanessa Whitmore's distorted lens. Ms. Whitmore ended her call with a dramatic snap of her clutch purse. She flagged down Miguel as he passed. "Young man," she said, her voice now filled with a manufactured tremor of fear. "That girl," she jutted her chin towards Zara, "was incredibly hostile when I questioned her seating, and the other attendant just brushed me off. Given the circumstances, I must insist you get a security officer. I want her credentials properly verified. I will not be trapped in a metal tube for 6 hours with someone who becomes aggressive at the slightest provocation." This was the twist of the knife. She was framing her own prejudice as a legitimate safety concern, a tactic that was as cowardly as it was effective. She was using the very systems designed to protect passengers as a tool of harassment. Miguel, utterly out of his depth, swallowed hard. "Ma'am," the other flight attendant confirmed her ticket. Confirmed a piece of paper. Vanessa scoffed. "In this day and age, that's not enough. I want a federal officer to check her ID against the manifest. It's standard procedure when a passenger is causing a disturbance." "But she hasn't caused a disturbance," Miguel whispered, casting a desperate look at Zara. Her hostile reaction was the disturbance Vanessa insisted, her voice rising. "Are you refusing to act on a passenger security concern? I will be taking your name and employee number." The threat worked perfectly. Miguel's face paled. The fear of a formal complaint of a black mark on his record outweighed his fledgling sense of duty. Without another word, he turned and skewed towards the cockpit. As Miguel retreated, he passed Diana in the galley, his face a mask of conflict. "I can't lose this job, Diana," he whispered urgently. "My mom's medication, my sister's tuition, they all depend on me. But what she's doing to that girl, it's wrong." Diana squeezed his shoulder. "I know, Miguel. I've been there. Go get the captain. I'll handle this." Meanwhile, a young woman across the aisle, a college student around 19, was surreptitiously recording the scene on her phone. Her expression a mixture of disgust and fascination. Another passenger, a businessman in his 40s, was studiously avoiding looking in Zara's direction. The uncomfortable silence of the privileged bystander, Zara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was spiraling. She was a character in a play she didn't write, and the script was getting darker by the second. A flash of anger surged through her, white hot and electric. She wanted to stand up, to shout, to call this woman exactly what she was, a bigot using her privilege as a weapon. Her hands curled into fists, nails digging into her palms. The injustice of it burned like acid in her throat. Then just as quickly, she regained control. Getting angry would only validate Vanessa's lies. She uncurled her fingers, took a deep breath, and centered herself. She would not give this woman the satisfaction of proving her false narrative correct. Diana, noticing the commotion, hurried back. "What's going on now?" she asked, her gaze falling on Vanessa's triumphant smirk. "I have lodged a formal security concern about the passenger in 2A, and your colleague has gone to follow protocol," Vanessa stated smugly. Diana's professional facade finally cracked, replaced by a flash of genuine anger. "You did what, ma'am? You are creating a delay for 300 people based on absolutely nothing." "Based on my personal safety," Vanessa retorted coolly. "Something I'm sure Transglobal Airways takes very seriously." The cockpit door opened and the first officer leaned out. He exchanged a few hushed words with Miguel, his eyes scanning the first-class cabin. His gaze rested on Zara for a moment, unreadable, before he nodded and retreated back inside. Miguel returned to his position, avoiding Zara's eyes. He whispered to an older flight attendant who glanced at Zara with a mixture of pity and suspicion. The whispers spread like a virus through the cabin crew. A moment later, the gentle cabin chimes were replaced by a firm announcement from the flight deck. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Grayson. We apologize for the slight delay. We are dealing with a minor cabin issue and have asked for ground personnel to assist. We appreciate your patience and expect to be on our way shortly." A minor cabin issue. That's what she was. A problem to be solved. A thing. The humiliation was a physical sensation now. A hot flush that spread from her chest to her cheeks. She wanted to be invisible, to shrink into the luxurious upholstery of seat 2A until she disappeared completely. But then she thought of her father, of the prototype in her bag, of the fellowship waiting for her. She had done nothing wrong. She would not be erased. She squared her shoulders and met the curious and suspicious stares of the other passengers with a calm she didn't feel. Across the aisle, a businessman in seat 3C, a quiet man of Indian descent named Dr. Amit Patel, discreetly angled his phone downwards, the small red light of its recording function blinking almost imperceptibly like a tiny beacon of justice in the darkness of prejudice. He had seen this kind of drama unfold before, and he knew the value of an impartial witness. His pressed Oxford shirt and conservative tie contrasted with the fire of determination in his eyes. The jet bridge, which had just begun to pull away, groaned as it redocked with the aircraft. The cabin door hissed open. A gate agent and an unformed officer stepped inside. But it wasn't an airport police officer. Zara recognized the insignia and the severe no-nonsense demeanor immediately. This was a federal air marshal. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a military-style haircut and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. His name tag read, R. Bennett. He bypassed the flight attendants completely and walked directly to Vanessa Whitmore's seat, his presence sucking the remaining oxygen out of the cabin. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Bennett. I'm told you have a security concern," he said, his voice a low, growly rumble that commanded attention. Vanessa launched into her performance, pointing a trembling finger at Zara. "Yes, officer." This person became extremely agitated and aggressive when I simply asked about the seating arrangements. Her ticket seems questionable, and her whole demeanor is threatening. The flight staff refused to take it seriously. I'm afraid for my safety and the safety of this flight. Officer Bennett didn't even glance at Diana, who was standing beside him, her mouth open in disbelief. He didn't ask for her side of the story or consult the captain. He turned his full, intimidating attention on the 17-year-old girl in seat 2A. His eyes were cold flat and utterly devoid of curiosity. They were the eyes of a man who had already made up his mind. He saw not a teenage girl, a student, a gifted inventor. He saw the aggressive and threatening subject of a complaint. He saw a problem to be removed. "Miss," he began, his voice leaving no room for argument, "I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and come with me." The officer's words hung in the sterile, recycled air of the cabin. "I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and come with me." It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the unassailable weight of federal authority. For a moment, Zara couldn't breathe. The entire world had shrunk to the space between her and Officer Bennett. The faces of the other passengers blurred into a gallery of muted curiosity and discomfort. All the systems she believed in, logic, reason, fairness, were failing spectacularly. A lie had been told, and the man with the gun and the badge had accepted it as gospel. "Officer, on what grounds?" Zara asked. Her voice was steady, a small miracle she would later marvel at. The programmer in her brain was screaming for data, for a logical premise to this absurd conclusion. Bennett's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to being questioned, especially not by a teenager. "On the grounds that you are causing a disturbance and failing to comply with crew instructions," he stated, clipping his words. "I have not caused a disturbance." Zara countered, her voice rising slightly. "And I have complied with every instruction. Your colleague." She gestured towards Diana, verified my boarding pass. "This woman," she nodded towards Vanessa, "is lying." Diana Martinez stepped forward, her face a mask of professional courage. "Officer Bennett, I am the lead flight attendant for this cabin. I can confirm that Miss Jackson has been polite and cooperative. Her ticket is valid. The other passenger, Ms. Whitmore, initiated this confrontation. There is no security threat here." Bennett gave Diana a look of withering dismissal. "Your job is to serve drinks, not to make security assessments. Stand back." The insult was sharp and public, designed to neuter Diana's authority and put her back in her place. Diana flinched as if struck, her face turning a shade of angry red, but she held her ground, remaining near Zara's seat. Bennett focused back on Zara. "I'm not going to ask you again. Get your things. Let's go." He took a step closer, his physical presence an act of intimidation. Zara felt a primal surge of fear, but it was quickly overtaken by a cold, sharp anger. This was wrong. This was a perversion of everything she'd been taught about justice. If she walked off this plane, she would be validating Vanessa's lie. She would be accepting the role of the aggressor they had written for her. "No," she said. The word was quiet but firm. A small stone dropped into a silent pool. "I am a ticketed passenger in my assigned seat. I have done nothing wrong. I am not leaving." A collective gasp rippled through the first-class cabin. Dr. Patel, in seat 3C, adjusted the angle of his phone slightly. He was capturing at all the officer's aggressive posture. The flight attendant's plea, the teenager's quiet defiance. Officer Bennett's face darkened. The veneer of professional detachment cracked, revealing the raw prejudice beneath. He saw a black teenager defying a white officer, and it was a scenario his worldview could not tolerate. "You are now interfering with the duties of a federal air marshal." He growled, his hand moving almost unconsciously to rest on the butt of his holstered firearm. "That is a federal offense. I can and will have you arrested and removed from this aircraft in handcuffs. Is that what you want?" The sight of his hand on the weapon sent a cold rush of adrenaline through Zara's body. Her mouth went dry, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. The leather seat beneath her suddenly felt like ice. There was a roaring in her ears, like standing too close to a waterfall. This man, this armed federal agent, was threatening her over a seat she had paid for all because another passenger couldn't accept her presence. The threat of handcuffs, of an arrest record, was terrifying. It could derail everything. The fellowship her future, her life. The fear was a cold hand squeezing her heart. She could feel tears welling up hot and stinging, but she refused to let them fall. Crying would be seen as hysteria, as guilt. "You can't arrest me for sitting in a seat I paid for," she said, her voice trembling but unbroken. "I have rights. Your rights end when you become a threat to my flight." Bennett retorted, his voice booming through the cabin. "And right now, you are the threat. You're not afraid of me," Zara said suddenly, finding her voice again stronger now. "You're afraid of what I represent, a world where your privilege isn't the only currency that matters." The words hung in the air, stunning Bennett into momentary silence. Even Vanessa seemed taken aback by the teenager's eloquence and defiance. Vanessa Whitmore watched from her seat, a sickeningly self-satisfied smirk playing on her lips. This was exactly what she had wanted: the validation of her prejudice, the exercise of her privilege, the public humiliation of the girl who didn't belong. She had successfully manipulated the system, bending its power to serve her own petty bigotry. The pilot, Captain Grayson, emerged from the cockpit, his face grim. He was a man in his late 50s with a calm, authoritative air. But the situation in his first-class cabin was now spiraling beyond the scope of a simple passenger dispute. "Officer, what's the issue here?" Grayson asked, his voice a low baritone that cut through the tension. "The issue," Captain Bennett said, not bothering to turn around fully, "is that this passenger is being disruptive and refusing to deplane. She needs to be removed before we can take off." Captain Grayson looked at Zara, then at Diana, who shook her head almost imperceptibly, a silent signal that Bennett's account was false. The captain was now in an impossible position. The flight was already delayed. He had a federal officer on his aircraft declaring a passenger a threat. But his most experienced flight attendant was telling him a different story. The ultimate authority on the plane was his but to overrule. A federal air marshal was a career. Risking move. He looked at Zara, his expression one of weary pragmatism. "Missy," said, his tone softer than Bennett's, but no less final. "We have to get this flight in the air. We can sort this out on the ground. For the good of everyone on board, I am asking you to cooperate with the officer." It was a betrayal from the last person she thought would fold. The captain wasn't siding with the lie, but he was choosing the path of least resistance. He was choosing to sacrifice her dignity for the sake of an on-time departure. The knot of fear and anger in Zara's chest coalesced into a single point of clarity. They had taken away her voice. They had ignored her proof. They had rejected the testimony of the crew. They had left her with nothing. Almost nothing. "Okay," she said, her voice suddenly calm. The sudden acquiescence surprised Bennett and the captain. "I will cooperate, but the law says I am entitled to one phone call. I'd like to make it now before I go anywhere." Bennett scoffed. "You're not under arrest yet. You don't get a phone call. It's not a legal right. It's an airline policy for disputed passengers being removed from a flight." Diana interjected quickly, seeing a lifeline and grabbing it. Trans-Global Policy 4.7 clearly states she's allowed a brief call to arrange for her needs on the ground. It was a slight fabrication, a bending of a vague rule, but it was delivered with such authority that Bennett hesitated. Captain Grayson, eager to end the standoff, seized the opportunity. "Let her make the call, officer. 5 minutes. Then we can resolve this." Bennett grunted his assent, crossing his arms and tapping his foot impatiently. He believed he had won. He saw this as the final futile gesture of a troublemaker before her inevitable removal. Zara pulled out her smartphone. Her hands were shaking, but her fingers were steady as she navigated to her contacts. She ignored the texts from her friends, asking if she'd boarded yet. She went straight to the top of her favorites list, the one marked with a star. She pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, then a calm, familiar voice answered. "Zara Bear, everything okay? You should be taking off. Hi, Dad." Zara said, her voice breaking just a little. "Not exactly. I have a problem." And as Officer Bennett and Captain Grayson stood by impatiently, and Vanessa Whitmore watched with glee, Zara Jackson began to explain the situation to her father. Malcolm Jackson was in his office on the 58th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, a room with panoramic views that usually calmed him. He had been reviewing quarterly threat assessment reports, a litany of digital phantoms and corporate espionage attempts. When his phone rang with Zara's picture on the screen, he had smiled, expecting a quick call before she powered down for her flight. The smile vanished as he listened. His daughter's voice, usually so full of confidence and spark, was strained, trembling on the edge of tears, but held in check by sheer force of will. He listened without interrupting as she laid out the facts with the clinical precision he had taught her. The woman in 2B, the false accusations, the flight attendant who tried to help the arrival of an air marshal named Bennett, the pilot's request for her to leave, and the ultimatum. With every word, a cold tectonic fury built deep within him. Malcolm Jackson was a man who had built a global cybersecurity empire from nothing. He had faced down hostile boardrooms, outmaneuvered corporate raiders, and negotiated with governments. He understood power not just in the form of money, but in the form of information and leverage. The one thing in the world he was truly vulnerable to was the well-being of his child. And these people, these strangers on an airplane, were hurting his child. His first instinct was primal. He wanted to roar, to threaten to unleash the full force of his considerable resources on this Officer Bennett, but he smothered it instantly. Rage was a blunt instrument. This situation required a scalpel. "Zara," he said, his voice a paradigm of calm. "Listen to me very carefully. Are you on speaker? No, Dad. Put me on speaker. Hold the phone up so the officer and the captain can hear me clearly." Zara did as she was told. "You're on speaker, Dad." "Good." Malcolm's voice, rich and resonant, filled the silent cabin. "My name is Malcolm Jackson. I am Zara's father." "To whom am I speaking?" Officer Bennett, annoyed by the delay, stepped forward. "This is Federal Air Marshal Richard Bennett. Sir, your daughter needs to deplane immediately. This call is over." "No, Officer Bennett. This call is just beginning." Malcolm replied, his tone hardening. "You are currently illegally detaining my minor daughter based on the unsubstantiated and frankly slanderous claims of another passenger. You have ignored the testimony of the airline's own lead flight attendant, and you are attempting to remove my daughter from a service she has paid for. Sir, your daughter is a security risk." My daughter Malcolm, cut him off, his voice like cracking ice, is a 17-year-old girl on her way to a science fellowship. The only security risk in that cabin right now, Officer Bennett, is you, a federal agent who is so blinded by his own biases that he cannot distinguish between a passenger and a threat. You are a liability. A nervous murmur went through the cabin. The passengers were no longer just watching a dispute, they were listening to a takedown. Captain Grayson stepped in, trying to reclaim his aircraft. "Mr. Jackson, this is Captain Thomas Grayson. I understand you're upset, but we need to handle this on the ground." "Captain Grayson." Malcolm interrupted, his voice sharp. "I hold you responsible. You are the commander of this vessel. Yet you are allowing a member of your crew and a passenger to be harassed by an overzealous officer. You've chosen expediency over your duty of care." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then he delivered the first incision of the scalpel. "I'm sure you're both busy men, so let me get to the point. Zara, what's the name of the airline you're flying? Trans-Global Airways." "Dad, Trans-Global." Malcolm repeated, a dangerous edge to his voice. "Officer Bennett, Captain Grayson, the company I own and operate is called Nexus Cybershield. Perhaps you've heard of it. We are the premier cybersecurity firm for the global transportation industry. And for the last 3 years, Nexus Cybershield has held the exclusive multi-billion-dollar contract to protect Trans-Global Airways' entire digital infrastructure. That includes their reservation systems, their internal networks, their flight control software, and most importantly, their passenger data liability protocols." Silence. Absolute stunned silence. Vanessa Whitmore's smug expression began to dissolve, replaced by a flicker of confusion, and then dawning horror. Bennett and Grayson exchanged a look of disbelief. Captain Grayson's face showed a flash of recognition. He had attended a cybersecurity seminar 2 years ago where Malcolm Jackson had been the keynote speaker, though they had never formally met. The pieces clicked into place with terrible clarity. Malcolm continued, his voice now dangerously soft. That contract, which is personally overseen by me, contains several key clauses. Among them are strict covenants regarding passenger treatment, anti-discrimination, and brand integrity. A publicly documented incident of racial profiling, especially one involving a federal officer and condoned by the flight's captain, constitutes what our legal team would call a catastrophic brand-damaging event. It is a material breach of our service agreement. He let that sink in for a moment. He wasn't just a rich dad complaining. He was the man who held the keys to their kingdom. And he was explaining, in precise legal and financial terms, how they had just violated the terms of their partnership. So here is what is going to happen. Malcolm stated, his voice devoid of any emotion except for absolute certainty. You are not going to lay a hand on my daughter. You are not going to speak another word to her. Captain Grayson, you will return to your cockpit and you will wait for a call from your CEO, Howard Reynolds, a man I have on speed dial. Officer Bennett, you will stand down and await instructions from your superiors at the TSA, who will also be hearing from Mr. Reynolds and then from my general counsel. My daughter will remain in her seat. This aircraft will not be going anywhere until this is resolved to my satisfaction. Malcolm's voice sharpened to a razor edge. Today, you tried to remove my daughter from a seat. Tomorrow, I'll remove you from your career. He took a breath. Zara, sweetie, is that all clear? Yes, Dad. Zara whispered a single tear of relief, finally tracing a path down her cheek. Good. Stay on the line. I'm making another call now. Zara held the phone, the speaker still on. The silence in the cabin was broken only by the faint hum of the ventilation. Officer Bennett stood frozen, his face pale, his mask of authority shattered. Captain Grayson looked like he had seen a ghost. Vanessa Whitmore had shrunk into her seat, her face ashen, trying to become invisible. The entire power dynamic on the aircraft had just been inverted by a single phone call. The prejudice had collided with a system of immense and now deeply personal corporate power, and the prejudice was about to be obliterated. The second call was brutally efficient. Zara and everyone in the first-class cabin could hear the faint, tiny ringing from her phone speaker, followed by an alert professional voice. Howard Reynolds. Howard. It's Malcolm Jackson. Malcolm's voice was back to its calm boardroom tone, but it was underlined with steel. Malcolm, to what do I owe the pleasure I trust our Q3 projections are looking solid? Reynolds' voice was jovial, the sound of a man who believed he was talking to a valued business partner. We have a problem, Howard. A 5-alarm fire. I'm on the phone with my 17-year-old daughter, Zara. She's currently in C2A on your Flight 88 from JFK to SFO, and she's being threatened with arrest by a federal air marshal. While your captain stands by and watches, there was a moment of dead air on the other end. The joviality vanished, replaced by a sharp intake of breath. What, Malcolm, that's impossible. There must be a mistake. The only mistake, Howard, Malcolm said coolly, will be yours if you don't handle this in the next 90 seconds. My daughter has been racially profiled by another passenger. Your crew failed to de-escalate, and a federal officer is now threatening to put her in handcuffs because she refused to be illegally removed from her seat. I have this entire interaction on an open line. It is being recorded. Zara glanced at Dr. Patel, who gave her a subtle affirmative nod. His own phone still discreetly pointed forward. The officer's name is Richard Bennett. The captain is a Mr. Grayson. Malcolm continued his words like hammer blows. Howard, as per Section 12, subsection B of our agreement, I am officially flagging this incident as a critical security and liability failure. An agent of the federal government is acting in an unstable and biased manner on your aircraft. I no longer have confidence in the security of that plane. Furthermore, my daughter, a minor, is in a state of extreme distress due to the actions of your employees and this officer. This is a clear violation of your duty of care, Malcolm. Please. Reynolds' voice was strained, panicked. Let me get my head of operations on this. We'll sort it out. We'll apologize to your daughter. We'll offer compensation. We're past apologies, Howard. We're in the realm of consequences. Malcolm said, his voice dropping. Here is my demand. The flight is not to take off. My daughter is not to be moved or spoken to any further. You will have your senior, most executive at JFK meet her at the gate with a full security detail to escort her to a private lounge. You will arrange for a private jet to take her to San Francisco as soon as it can be fueled. It was an audacious demand, a clear demonstration of power. A private jet, Malcolm. That's the opening offer, Howard Malcolm said flatly. The alternative is that my legal team files an injunction in the next 30 minutes citing the material breach of contract. We will suspend all Nexus services to TransGlobal pending a full federal investigation. Think about what happens to your airline tomorrow morning when the markets open and news breaks that your cybersecurity provider, the best in the world, has declared your entire system a liability. Your stock will be in free fall by 9:31 a.m. Your choice. It was checkmate. The CEO of TransGlobal Airways was being presented with two options: an astronomically expensive and embarrassing concession to one passenger, or the complete implosion of his company's public and financial standing. The silence on the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. Officer Bennett was sweating now, beads of moisture visible on his forehead. Captain Grayson had his eyes closed, as if trying to will himself away from the career-ending disaster unfolding in his cabin. Finally, Reynolds' voice came back defeated. I understand. Consider it done, Malcolm. I'll make the calls myself right now. My deepest, most sincere apologies to Zara. Don't apologize to me, Howard. Apologize to my daughter. And more importantly, fix your company. Malcolm said, then disconnected the call. Zara's phone returned to a conversation with her father. Dad, she whispered, overwhelmed. It's okay now, Zara Bear. It's over. Someone will be there for you shortly. He said, his voice finally softening, the paternal warmth returning. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. We'll talk more soon. I love you. I love you too, Dad. The call ended. For a moment, the cabin remained in a state of suspended animation. Then the captain's phone buzzed. He answered it, his face turning even paler as he listened. He spoke only 2 words. Yes, sir. He hung up and turned to face the first-class cabin, his expression grim. He looked at Officer Bennett, then at Vanessa Whitmore, with a gaze of pure, unadulterated fury. Then he turned to the intercom, his hand shaking slightly as he pressed the button. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. His voice was strained heavy with a new shocking weight. Due to an unforeseen and non-negotiable security concern that requires a full review of our operating protocols, TransGlobal Flight 88 has been cancelled. A wave of groans and angry shouts erupted from the back of the plane. Cancelled. A full flight doors closed ready for pushback was being cancelled. The absurdity of it was lost on the disgruntled passengers in economy and business class. We ask that you please remain seated until the jet bridge is reattached. Ground staff will be in the terminal to assist you with rebooking. We apologize for the extreme inconvenience. The announcement was a bomb that detonated the fragile piece of the aircraft. Chaos erupted. People were yelling, demanding explanations. Flight attendants, looking utterly bewildered, tried to calm the passengers. But in the first-class cabin, there was a different kind of chaos. It was the quiet, devastating chaos of lives and careers imploding in real time. Officer Bennett, the immovable object of authority just minutes before, looked lost. He fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling too much to unlock it. Vanessa Whitmore was hyperventilating, her face a mask of pure terror. She had poked a bear only to discover it was a dragon. Her petty act of malice had grounded a 300-person intercontinental flight. She was no longer a victim. She was the cause of a multi-million-dollar incident. Amidst the pandemonium, Zara Jackson sat quietly in seat 2A. She watched the fallout, the shockwaves of her father's call spreading through the metal tube. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel vindictive. She just felt tired. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, she felt safe. The jet bridge thumped against the fuselage, the sound of a rescue she never should have needed. The deplaning process was a study in contrasts. For the passengers in economy and business, it was a chaotic, infuriating ordeal. They shuffled off the plane into the terminal, grumbling about missed connections and ruined plans to be met by overwhelmed gate agents offering hotel vouchers and rebooking options. They were the collateral damage, unaware of the specific drama that had scuttled their journey. For the first-class cabin, it was a slow, deliberate extraction. Airline officials, led by a stone-faced woman in a sharp suit, the JFK station manager Victoria Alvarez, boarded the aircraft before anyone was allowed to leave. Her eyes immediately found Zara Miss Jackson. Ms. Alvarez asked, her voice a mixture of deference and extreme anxiety. "I'm Victoria Alvarez. On behalf of Transglobal Airways, I am so sorry for what you have experienced. We have a private lounge ready for you. Please come with me." She pointedly ignored Officer Bennett and Vanessa Whitmore. Two Port Authority police officers followed her onto the plane. They did not approach Zara. Instead, they stood sentinel at the front of the cabin. As Zara gathered her things, her hands still shaking slightly, the adrenaline now wearing off, leaving her fingers trembling like autumn leaves. "Diana," the lead flight attendant touched her arm gently. "I am so sorry," she whispered, her eyes filled with genuine remorse and anger. "I've already requested to file a full incident report. If you need a witness for anything, here's my personal number." She discreetly passed Zara a slip of paper. "Thank you, Zara," said the words, feeling inadequate. Dr. Patel, the businessman from 3C, paused as he passed her in the aisle. He leaned in and spoke in a low voice. "I have the entire thing on video. The things she said, the officer, everything. I will be sending it to the airline and to the news media." What they did was not right. He gave her a respectful nod and continued on his way. "Dr. Patel," Zara said, recognizing him suddenly. "You're Dr. Amit Patel, the civil rights professor who wrote Invisible Barriers. I read your book for my social studies thesis." The academic's eyes widened in surprise, then crinkled with a warm smile. "Indeed I am, and now I've witnessed firsthand what I've only documented secondhand. Your courage today was remarkable, Miss Jackson." Zara walked off the plane, escorted by Ms. Alvarez, leaving the wreckage behind her. She didn't look back. Once she was gone, the atmosphere shifted. Ms. Alvarez turned to the Port Authority officers. "Officer Bennett and Ms. Whitmore are to be escorted to separate interview rooms. Their statements are required for our internal investigation and the federal inquiry that will be following. They are not to leave the airport." The word inquiry landed like a stone. Vanessa Whitmore began to sob, a pathetic theatrical display that earned no sympathy. "It was a misunderstanding. I was just concerned," she wailed as an officer gently but firmly guided her by the elbow. Officer Richard Bennett said nothing. The color had completely drained from his face. As a federal agent, he knew what an inquiry meant. It meant his career was at minimum on hold. More likely, it was over. He had operated on instinct, on a lifetime of ingrained biases, and had picked a fight with the one person on that plane he could not afford to cross. He was escorted off his broad shoulders, slumped in defeat. The authority he had wielded so brutally just 30 minutes earlier had evaporated completely. In the terminal, the contrast continued. Regular passengers milled about in frustrated confusion, forming long lines at customer service desks, arguing for compensation and alternate flights. Most of them cast annoyed glances at the private lounge where Zara had been whisked away, assuming it was filled with privileged elite passengers getting preferential treatment. They had no idea that behind those frosted glass doors, a 17-year-old girl was at the center of a corporate hurricane. Inside the lounge, Zara sat in a plush armchair sipping a cup of tea that had been pressed into her hands. The shock was starting to wear off, leaving behind a strange mixture of relief, anger, and unease. She was grateful for her father's intervention, but there was something deeply troubling about the entire sequence of events. Miss Jackson, Miss Alvarez said, sitting across from her. "I want to personally assure you that what happened today is being taken with the utmost seriousness. Mr. Reynolds has dispatched our corporate jet to take you to San Francisco as soon as possible. It's being fueled now and should be ready within the hour. Zara nodded, still processing. Additionally, Miss Alvarez continued, her voice hushed with professional awe. Your father has requested that we secure your prototype during transit. We've arranged for specialized handling to ensure it reaches the Lions facility safely. Of course they had. The mention of her father sent a complex wave of emotions through Zara. Pride, gratitude, but also a nagging discomfort. What would have happened if she had been just any other 17-year-old black girl? What if her father hadn't been Malcolm Jackson of Nexus Cyber Shield? What if she had been the daughter of a teacher, a nurse, a factory worker? The answer was brutally clear. She would have been marched off that plane, possibly in handcuffs. Her protestations would have meant nothing. Her future would have been imperiled by an arrest record. The prototype, her dream, would have been damaged or confiscated. All because a woman in seat 2B decided she didn't look like she belonged in first class. Her phone buzzed with the text from her father. "Everything okay, Victoria? Taking care of you," she texted back. "Yes, thank you for what you did." His response came immediately. "Always. No one messes with my little girl." She smiled slightly, but the unease persisted. Her father's power had saved her, but it was a reminder of how fragile justice could be when it depended on privilege and connections rather than being a universal right. Meanwhile, across the terminal, a very different scene was unfolding. Vanessa Whitmore sat in a sterile interview room. Her perfect makeup now streaked with tears, her composure shattered. Across from her sat two stern-faced airline security officials and a legal representative. The recording of her phone call, where she falsely claimed Zara was aggressive and threatening, had been replayed for her. Her attempts to explain away her words as a misunderstanding were met with stony silence. "Ms. Whitmore," the legal representative said, her voice clinical and detached. "The evidence suggests you knowingly made false statements that triggered a security response. These actions resulted in the cancellation of a flight with 300 passengers, costing the airline approximately $350,000 in direct expenses, not including the substantial reputational damage." Vanessa's face crumpled. "I was just concerned." "You were not concerned," the representative cut her off. "You were prejudiced, and you weaponized that prejudice in a way that created a substantial liability for this airline. We are currently evaluating our legal options regarding civil damages." The blood drained from Vanessa's face. Civil damages lawsuits, financial ruin. The full weight of her actions was finally sinking in. Furthermore, the security official added, "Your name has been added to our no-fly list effective immediately and indefinitely. You will not be flying on Trans-Global Airways or any of our code-share partners in the future." Vanessa's eyes widened in horror. "You can't do that. I travel for work. I need what you need." "Miss Whitmore is a lawyer," the representative replied coolly, and perhaps some serious self-reflection. A moment of recognition flickered across her face. "Jackson. Wait, Malcolm Jackson. I interviewed for a position at Nexus Cyber Shield 3 years ago. They rejected me." The security officials exchanged glances. This was a new and troubling dimension to her behavior. "Is that why you targeted his daughter?" the representative asked, her voice hardening. "No, I didn't know. I swear I didn't." Vanessa broke off, the realization of how deep a hole she had dug for herself, finally hitting home. In another room, Officer Richard Bennett was facing an even more severe reckoning. His superior, a stone-faced senior agent from the Air Marshal Service who had been flown in from Washington, D.C., sat across from him. On the table between them lay Bennett's badge and service weapon. 20 years, Bennett, the senior agent, said, his voice laced with disgust. 20 years in the service, and you throw it all away because you couldn't see past your own prejudices. "Sir, I was responding to a credible security concern," the agent snapped. "I've reviewed the flight attendant statement. I've seen the video. You didn't verify. You didn't investigate. You saw a young black woman and decided she was the threat. You let your bias override your training. And now the entire service has to deal with the fallout." Bennett's shoulders slumped. There was no defense, no justification that would stand up to scrutiny. Your suspension is effective immediately, the agent continued. A formal inquiry will follow, but I'm going to be blunt with you, Bennett. Start updating your resume. Your career with the Air Marshal Service is over. Back in the private lounge, Ms. Alvarez approached Zara with a tablet. Miss Jackson, we've received word that the corporate jet is ready. Also, your father asked me to show you this. She handed Zara the tablet, which displayed a news article that had just been published online. The headline read, Trans-Global Airways announces major overhaul of anti-discrimination training and policies. The article detailed how Transglobal was committing to a comprehensive review and reformation of its crew training, passenger complaint procedures, and security protocols, with a specific focus on eliminating bias. It mentioned a substantial financial commitment to this effort, including the establishment of a scholarship fund for underrepresented youths interested in aviation careers. Most surprisingly, the scholarship was to be named the Zara Jackson STEM Initiative. Zara looked up, stunned. This is happening now already. Miss Alvarez nodded, a small, genuine smile breaking through her professional facade. Your father is a very persuasive man, and I think the airline realized that true change couldn't wait for the next board meeting. Zara handed the tablet back, a complex emotion swelling in her chest. It wasn't vindication or triumph. It was something quieter, more profound. It was the realization that sometimes justice wasn't just about punishing the wrong, but transforming the system that allowed the wrong to happen in the first place. As she was escorted to the waiting corporate jet, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the terminal windows. She was still the same Zara who had boarded Flight 88 just hours ago, still a 17-year-old girl with dreams of changing the world with her neural interface. But something fundamental had shifted. She had glimpsed the ugly underbelly of privilege, and prejudice had felt its cold breath on her face, had nearly been crushed by its weight. And she had survived. Not just survived, but catalyzed change. The corporate jet was a sleek Gulfstream G650, a flying testament to luxury that made the first-class cabin of Flight 88 look positively pedestrian by comparison. As she settled into one of the plush leather seats, the sole passenger in an aircraft designed for 16, Zara finally let the full weight of the day's events wash over her. The jet taxied smoothly away from the terminal, leaving behind the chaos, the inquiries, the shattered careers, and the 300 stranded passengers. All because one woman couldn't accept that a young black girl belonged in seat 2A, and one father refused to let injustice stand. The investigation into the Flight 88 incident was swift and merciless, driven by the combined pressure of an apoplectic CEO, a looming multi-billion-dollar contract breach, and the imminent threat of a public relations nightmare. Malcolm Jackson's legal team had already been in contact, making it clear that full transparency and accountability were non-negotiable. Diana Martinez was interviewed first. She gave a calm, factual, and damning account of the entire event, from Vanessa Whitmore's initial snide remarks to Officer Bennett's dismissal of her authority. Her written report was even more detailed, noting the time of every exchange. I've stayed silent before. Never again, Diana said firmly at the conclusion of her testimony. I watched a similar incident 2 years ago and didn't speak up. I lost a promotion because I was afraid to rock the boat. It cost me professionally, but that girl that day, it cost her so much more. I promised myself I wouldn't let it happen again. Miguel Rodriguez was next. In his interview, he was a wreck, alternating between tears and terrified apologies. He admitted that he had buckled under Vanessa's threat of a complaint and had not followed protocol by immediately deferring to his senior partner, Diana. I was afraid, he said, his voice breaking. My mother's medication costs doubled last month. My sister's tuition is due next week. I thought I couldn't afford to lose this job, but I was wrong. I couldn't afford to lose my integrity. Then came Dr. Patel's video. He had emailed it to the Trans-Global Corporate Affairs office before he even left the terminal. The high-quality audio and clear video were undeniable. It captured Vanessa's venomous, "I don't feel safe" phone call. It showed Bennett's aggression, his hand on his weapon, his threats to the calm-seated teenager. It showed Diana's attempts to de-escalate and Bennett's sexist, dismissive retort. Dr. Patel, as it turned out, wasn't just any witness. He was a leading civil rights academic who specialized in transportation discrimination. His accompanying letter noted that he was already incorporating the incident into his upcoming book on bias in commercial aviation. The video was the nail in the coffin, a perfect, unblinking record of the prejudice and abuse of power that had taken place. Vanessa Whitmore's interview was a disaster. She tried to play the victim, portraying Zara as sullen and unresponsive, and herself as a concerned citizen. But when confronted with Dr. Patel's video, her story crumbled. Her lies were laid bare. Her manufactured fear exposed as petty, vindictive racism. She became belligerent, then tearful, then silent. The revelation of her failed interview at Nexus Cyber Shield 3 years earlier added another disturbing dimension to her behavior. While she insisted she hadn't recognized Malcolm Jackson's name or made the connection to Zara, investigators remained skeptical. The coincidence seemed too perfect. Officer Bennett's interview was conducted by a grim-faced superior from the Air Marshal Service. Bennett attempted to hide behind procedure and jargon. He claimed he had assessed a credible threat based on a passenger report, but the video contradicted him at every turn. It showed he had made no attempt to verify the claim, had ignored the flight crew, and had escalated the situation with his own hostility. His defense was paper-thin, and his superior knew it. At the end of the interview, Bennett was forced to surrender his badge and service weapon. Pending the outcome of the formal inquiry, he was officially suspended. While the gears of corporate and federal justice began to grind, Zara was being treated like royalty. The corporate jet had delivered her to San Francisco with a smoothness and speed that commercial aviation could never match. A private car had whisked her from the airport directly to the Leon's Applied Sciences Incubator, where the program director, Dr. Elisa Morales, had been waiting to personally welcome her, having been briefed about the unfortunate incident at JFK. Zara's prototype had been hand-delivered by a special courier treated with more care than most museum artifacts. Her accommodations had been upgraded from the standard fellowship dormitory to a private apartment with security access. Everyone was going out of their way to make her comfortable, to erase the memory of what had happened on Flight 88. But Zara couldn't forget. The incident had left a mark, a psychological bruise that ached when pressed. She found herself hesitating in doorways, questioning whether she truly belonged in spaces, even when she had every right to be there. The confidence she had always carried was now shadowed by a new awareness of how quickly it could be stripped away by someone with authority and prejudice. 3 days after arriving in San Francisco, she finally had a proper video call with her father. Malcolm's face filled her laptop screen, his eyes searching hers for signs of lingering distress. "How are you holding up, Zara Bear?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I'm okay, Dad," she replied, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "The fellowship is amazing. Dr. Morales is brilliant, and the resources here are beyond anything I expected." Malcolm nodded, but his gaze remained intent. "And how are you really—" The question hung in the air, an invitation to drop the brave face. Zara felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crack. "I keep thinking about it," she admitted, her voice smaller now. "Not just what happened, but what could have happened. If you hadn't been who you are, if you hadn't had that leverage, but I am, and I did," Malcolm said firmly. "That's the world we live in, Zara. Power recognizes power. It shouldn't be that way, but it is. That's what bothers me," Zara said, a hint of her usual intensity returning. "Justice shouldn't depend on who your father is or what company he owns. It should be a right, not a privilege." Malcolm's expressions softened with pride. "You're right, and that's why I didn't just stop at getting you off that plane. We're making changes, Zara, real ones." He told her about these developments that had occurred in the wake of the incident. The Air Marshal Service had opened a comprehensive review of their profiling protocols. Transglobal Airways had not only committed to overhauling their training, but had also implemented an immediate review of all passenger complaint procedures. The story had begun to spread through industry circles, prompting other airlines to preemptively examine their own practices. I recently spoke with Aisha Carter, the CEO, who faced a similar situation at Horizon Grand Hotel. Malcolm mentioned she's been fighting this battle in the hospitality industry. We're coordinating efforts now, sharing data and strategies. This isn't just about airlines or hotels anymore. It's about creating accountability across industries. And the Zara Jackson STEM initiative, she asked, still uncomfortable with having her name attached to something so public, is already funded and accepting applications. Malcolm confirmed. We've structured it to prioritize young women of color pursuing careers in aviation and technology. It's not just a scholarship. It includes mentorship, internship placements, and ongoing support. Zara was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she asked the question that had been gnawing at her since the incident. Dad, have you ever had to do something like that before? Use your position to force justice? Malcolm's expression grew serious a few times. Not often, and never with quite so much at stake. But Zara Power is a tool. Like any tool, it's defined by how you use it. I built Nexus from nothing because I was tired of being underestimated and dismissed. I promised myself that if I ever gained real influence, I would use it to make sure others didn't face the same barriers. He leaned closer to the camera. What happened on that plane was wrong. Not just wrong for you, but wrong in principle. If leveraging our position forces Transglobal and others to re-examine how they treat all passengers, not just those with powerful parents, then I make no apologies for wielding that leverage. Zara nodded slowly. Her father's words resonated with her own developing philosophy. She had created her neural interface prototype not for glory or profit, but to give voice to those who had been silenced by physical limitations. At its core, her work was about empowerment, about using technology to level an uneven playing field. Perhaps there was a parallel here. Her father had used his corporate power as a kind of interface bridging the gap between injustice and accountability in a system that often failed to make that connection on its own. I understand, she said finally. And I'm grateful, not just for what you did for me, but for what you're doing to make sure it doesn't happen to someone else. Malcolm smiled, the tension in his shoulders visibly relaxing. That's my girl, always seeing the bigger picture. They talked for a while longer about her project, about the fellowship, about normal father-daughter things. It was a return to normally that Zara desperately needed. When they finally said goodbye, she felt lighter than she had in days. Later that evening, she received an unexpected email. It was from Diana Martinez, the flight attendant who had stood up for her on Flight 88. The subject line read, "Thought you should know." The email contained a brief message. Dear Zara, I wanted to let you know that I've been promoted to a senior training position with Transglobal. They've asked me to help develop and implement the new amphibious protocols that will be required for all crew members. It's not a position I ever expected to have, but I'm determined to use it to make real change. What happened to you should never happen to anyone else. Thank you for your courage. You've made more of a difference than you know. Warmly, Diana Martinez. Attached to the email was a news article. The headline read, Federal Air Marshal suspended after racial profiling incident on Transglobal flight. The article detailed Bennett's suspension and the broader inquiry into profiling practices within the Air Marshal Service. It also mentioned that a passenger involved in making false claims had been permanently banned from flying with Transglobal and its partners. Even more surprising was a follow-up story about a passenger named James Wilson, a 19-year-old community college student who had been allowed to remain in his first-class seat on a different Transglobal flight, despite a similar complaint. The new protocols had already been implemented, and the crew had handled the situation properly, verifying his ticket, dismissing the unfounded complaint, and ensuring he enjoyed the service he had paid for. Honestly, I was shocked. Wilson was quoted as saying, "I was ready to be kicked off, because that's what usually happens." But the attendant just smiled, confirmed my seat, and told the other passenger that my presence wasn't up for debate. It felt like being treated like a person. Zara sat back in her chair, a complex mixture of emotions washing over her. There was a certain satisfaction in knowing that actions had consequences, that the people who had tried to humiliate and remove her were facing the repercussions of their behavior. But there was no joy in it, no sense of vindication or triumph. Instead, there was a quiet recognition that justice, when it came, was not about revenge, but about restoration and reform. She opened her laptop and began to work on her neural interface project with renewed purpose. What had happened on Flight 88 had shown her in the starkest possible terms how it felt to be silenced, to have your voice and your rights dismissed. It strengthened her resolve to create a technology that would ensure no one was silenced by circumstance, that everyone had the means to express their truth. As her fingers flew across the keyboard, coding the algorithms that would translate neural patterns into speech, Zara Jackson was doing more than developing a technology. She was crafting her own response to injustice, not with power or privilege, but with innovation and empathy. In the weeks and months that followed the incident on Flight 88, the consequences continued to unfold, not with a single dramatic bang, but with the slow, grinding certainty of a tectonic plate shifting. For Zara Jackson, life moved forward. She thrived at the Lions Fellowship, her neural interface project earning accolades and additional funding. The incident on the plane became a strange, surreal memory, a scar she knew was there, but didn't look at every day. Her father had handled the fallout, shielding her from the legal and media storm that followed. She knew there were repercussions, but she was deliberately kept at a distance, allowed to be a 17-year-old genius, not a symbol or a victim. For the architects of her ordeal, however, there was no such peace. Their lives were systematically and irrevocably dismantled by what became known internally at TransGlobal as the Jackson Protocol. Officer Richard Bennett's suspension became a termination. The Federal Air Marshal Service, under intense pressure from the Department of Transportation and several members of Congress that Malcolm Jackson had on his contact list, made an example of him. The official reason was gross misconduct and failure to follow de-escalation protocols. The unofficial reason was that he had become a massive liability. But it didn't stop there. Malcolm Jackson's private security and legal teams, under the guise of cooperating with the investigation, conducted a deep dive into Bennett's past. They uncovered a pattern. 2 other formal complaints had been filed against him in his 10-year career, both by minority passengers, both dismissed by his superiors. Nexus CyberShield investigators packaged this information, along with sworn affidavit from the previous complainants, and delivered it to a hungry investigative reporter at a major newspaper. The resulting expose was brutal. Richard Bennett was painted as the face of profiling in the skies. His name and picture were everywhere. He lost his pension. He was sued in civil court by the Jackson family for emotional distress and defamation. Malcolm didn't want the money. The settlement, a significant 6-figure sum, was immediately donated to a legal fund for victims of racial profiling. Bennett tried to find work in private security, but his name was now toxic. No firm would touch him. The last anyone heard, Richard Bennett, the man who wielded federal authority with such arrogant certainty, was working as a night watchman at a self-esteem storage facility in a desolate part of New Jersey. A bitter, forgotten man, forever haunted by the ghost of Zara. Vanessa Whitmore's karma was just as relentless and perhaps more poetic. The video Dr. Patel took did not stay internal for long. A leaked copy found its way to a viral news aggregate, and from there it exploded across social media. She was quickly identified. The internet, in its ferocious and often cruel way, dubbed her first class Karen. Her employer, a high-powered management consulting firm in Boston, where she was a senior partner, was inundated with calls and emails. The firm prided itself on its image of diversity and inclusion, a carefully curated brand that Vanessa's actions had just set on fire. She was called into a meeting with the managing partners. They had seen the video. They had read the articles. They had seen their firm's name being dragged through the mud online. She tried to defend herself, but her arguments were hollow. She wasn't just a PR problem. She had demonstrated a profound lack of judgment and a character flaw that was incompatible with their corporate values. She was fired. Her severance package was the bare legal minimum. Her social life in the affluent Boston suburb where she lived disintegrated. Friends stopped returning her calls. She was asked to step down from the board of the local charity she chaired. The video of her sneering face was her digital ghost following her everywhere. Banned for life from TransGlobal and several of their partner airlines. Her world, which had revolved around travel and a sense of entitled status, shrank to the confines of her quiet, empty house. She had tried to eject a young woman from a world where she thought she didn't belong, and in the end had only succeeded in ejecting herself from her own. TransGlobal Airways paid a steep price as well. They avoided the full cancellation of the Nexus CyberShield contract, but the renegotiation was painful. Malcolm Jackson, holding all the cards, insisted on new terms. TransGlobal was forced to fund a multi-million-dollar independently audited overhaul of its employee training programs, focusing on de-escalation and implicit bias. The new program was designed and overseen by a consultancy firm, one recommended by Malcolm. Furthermore, as part of the settlement, the airline issued a formal public apology to Zara Jackson and her family, admitting fault. They also made a massive 8F-figure donation to establish the Zara Jackson STEM Initiative, a foundation administered by a neutral third party dedicated to providing scholarships and funding for young women of colour pursuing careers in technology. The ripple effects spread beyond TransGlobal. Other airlines, seeing the PR disaster and financial hit their competitor had taken, began preemptively revising their own policies. Within months, 4 major carriers had implemented new training programs for flight crews specifically addressing racial bias in passenger interactions. Smaller airlines followed suit. Industry standards began to shift. The Air Marshal Service, stung by the Bennett scandal, instituted a new oversight framework, including body cameras for marshals during active interventions and a civilian review process for complaints. The old culture of impunity was being slowly dismantled, replaced by a structure of accountability. Captain Thomas Grayson was demoted. He was not fired as the investigation concluded. He had been put in an untenable position by Bennett. But his dream of becoming a fleet chief was over. He spent the rest of his career flying less prestigious international cargo routes, a constant reminder of the day he chose expediency over courage. Miguel Rodriguez, the junior flight attendant, was retrained and moved to a probationary role in domestic service. His career permanently stunted by his moment of weakness. Diana Martinez, however, was promoted to a senior training position, where she was tasked with helping to implement the very programs her own bravery had made necessary. In the end, every action had an equal and opposite reaction. The prejudice, the abuse of power, the casual cruelty, it had all been entered into a great unseen ledger, and a 17-year-old girl's phone call to her father had simply ensured that the bill came due in full with interest. For Malcolm Jackson, the incident on Flight 88 became a catalyst for a more public role in addressing discrimination. He had always been a successful businessman who happened to be black. Now he was increasingly seen as a black businessman who used his success to drive change. Nexus CyberShield expanded its contract language with all clients to include strict anti-discrimination clauses, creating financial incentives for companies to address bias within their organizations. Malcolm also established a corporate division dedicated to developing AI tools that could identify patterns of discriminatory behavior in customer service interactions. The technology initially created to monitor airlines was soon adapted for use in healthcare, hospitality, and retail. What had begun as a father's protection of his daughter was evolving into a tech-driven approach to accountability across industries. As for Zara, the experience shaped her in ways both subtle and profound. Her neural interface project evolved to include applications beyond medical use. She began exploring how the technology could help document and validate experiences of discrimination, creating objective records of incidents that were too often dismissed as subjective or exaggerated. 6 months after the Flight 88 incident, Zara was invited to give a TED Talk about her work. Standing on the red carpet, her prototype elegantly displayed beside her. She spoke not just about the technical aspects of her invention, but about its deeper purpose. Technology at its best doesn't just solve problems, she told the audience. It restores balance. It gives voice to the voiceless and visibility to the overlooked. My neural interface began as a way to help people with physical limitations communicate. But I've come to see that silence takes many forms. Sometimes it's imposed by medical conditions. Sometimes it's enforced by systems of power and privilege that decide whose experiences matter and whose don't. She didn't directly mention what had happened on the plane. She didn't need to. The incident had received enough media coverage that many in the audience made the connection. When we create tools that allow everyone to speak their truth and have that truth acknowledged, she continued, we're not just advancing technology, we're advancing justice. The applause was thunderous. Video of her talk went viral, accumulating millions of views within days. Overnight, Zara Jackson became more than a promising young scientist. She became a symbol of resilience and a voice for change, but fame was never her goal. When the Lions Fellowship ended, she enrolled at MIT, where she continued to refine her neural interface technology. She maintained a low profile, focusing on her work rather than her brief moment in the spotlight. The Zara Jackson STEM initiative continued to grow, supporting dozens of young women pursuing careers in technology and aviation. On rare occasions, Zara would receive messages from people who had been on Flight 88 that day. A businessman who had witnessed everything from his seat in business class and had since become an advocate for amphibious training in his own company. A flight attendant who had been inspired by Diana's courage to speak up about discrimination she had observed. Even a message from Miguel Rodriguez apologizing once more for his failure to stand up for what was right. These messages, more than the headlines or the policy changes or the legal settlements, reminded Zara that stories had power. Her story, a 17-year-old girl facing down prejudice at 30,000 FT, had rippled outward, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways she could never have anticipated. 1 year to the day after the incident, Zara and Malcolm had dinner together in Boston, where she was attending a conference. Over dessert, Malcolm raised his glass in a toast. To my brilliant daughter, he said, his eyes shining with pride, who turned an act of injustice into a force for change. Zara clinked her glass against his. And to my father, she replied, who taught me that power isn't about domination, it's about transformation. Malcolm's expression grew serious. I've been thinking a lot about that day, Zara, about what it means that I had to use extraordinary measures to secure ordinary justice for my own daughter. It's not right that it took a CEO with a multi-billion-dollar contract to ensure that a black teenager was treated fairly. No, it's not. Zara agreed. But we're working on that, aren't we? You with your contract clauses and monitoring AI me with my neural interface. We're both trying to create accountability where it's lacking. Malcolm nodded slowly. Different tools, same goal. A world where justice isn't dependent on who you know or what leverage you have. A world where dignity is a right, not a privilege. 3 years later, Zara Jackson stood in the demonstration hall of the annual Global Tech Summit, watching as a young woman with cerebral palsy used Zara's neural interface to deliver a keynote address. The technology had evolved far beyond its original prototype. Now streamlined and elegant, the interface allowed users to translate their thoughts directly into speech with remarkable accuracy and natural inflection. Melissa Bailey, the keynote speaker, hadn't been able to communicate verbally for most of her life. Now she was addressing a room of 1,000 people, her voice synthesized but distinctly her own, filling the space with confidence and clarity. Freedom isn't just about physical movement, Melissa was saying through the interface. It's about being heard. It's about having your experiences validated and your presence acknowledged. As Melissa concluded her speech to enthusiastic applause, Zara felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see her father Malcolm, now in his mid-50s, but still commanding and vital. She's incredible, Malcolm said, nodding toward Melissa. You should be proud. I'm proud of her, Zara replied. I just made the tool. She's the one using it to change minds. They walked together toward the reception area, where attendees were mingling and networking. As they moved through the crowd, Zara noticed a familiar face. Diana Martinez, the flight attendant who had stood up for her that day on the plane. Diana had left Trans-Global Airways years ago. After helping to implement their new training programs, she had been recruited by the Federal Aviation Administration to consult on industry-wide standards for passenger treatment and crew response to discrimination. Her experience on Flight 88 had transformed her career, taking her from serving drinks to shaping policy. Diana Zara called out waving. The woman turned her face, lighting up with recognition. She made her way through the crowd to embrace Zara warmly. I can't believe it's you, Diana said, stepping back to look at her. Though I shouldn't be surprised. I've been following your work. It's revolutionary. It's what brings you to a tech conference, Zara asked. I'm actually here representing the FAA, Diana explained. We're looking at how new technologies might help address discrimination in transportation. Your neural interface has applications we hadn't considered. How so? Malcolm asked, joining the conversation. Well, Diana said, one of the biggest challenges in addressing bias incidents is the he said, she said nature of complaints. Objective documentation is rare, but what if passengers could opt in to record their interactions using technology like yours? It would create an unimpeachable record. Later that evening, Zara found a quiet moment alone on the conference center's terrace. The San Francisco skyline glittered before her, a constellation of human ambition and innovation. She thought about the paths that had brought her here, both the one she had chosen and the one that had been thrust upon her that day in first class. She had never wanted to be an activist or a symbol. She had simply wanted to create technology that helped people communicate. But the universe had a way of assigning roles you never auditioned for. Her experience on Flight 88 had woven itself into the fabric of her work, informing her understanding of power, voice, and justice in ways that made her technology more nuanced and empathetic. A soft ping from her phone interrupted her thoughts. It was a notification from the Zara Jackson STEM Initiative social media account. A new cohort of scholarship recipients had just been announced. She scrolled through the list of names and faces young women from diverse backgrounds who would now have opportunities they might otherwise have been denied. Among them was a girl named Amara Bennett. The last name gave Zara a pause. She tapped on the profile and read the brief bio. Amara was the niece of Richard Bennett, the Air Marshal from Flight 88. After her uncle's downfall, Amara had become interested in ethics and technology, specifically in how AI could be used to identify and mitigate bias in security screenings. She texted her father a link to the announcement, adding, "Look at the last name on the list." Life is strange. Malcolm's reply came moments later. Justice works in mysterious ways, but it always works. This story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the bill for prejudice comes due with devastating interest. Zara Jackson fought not just for a seat, but for her dignity, and her father used his power not for simple revenge, but for widespread accountability. The result wasn't just a cancelled flight. It was a chain reaction of consequences that brought real change and served a harsh but fitting dose of justice to those who abused their positions. What is your take on this? Was the outcome justified? Have you ever witnessed discrimination and wished you had the power to stop it? Or perhaps you've been in Zara's position yourself, facing prejudice with no Malcolm Jackson to call. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe in stories where justice prevails, show your support by hitting the like button, sharing this video, and subscribing for more incredible tales of drama and real-life karma. Thank you for listening.